Won't you be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen? Come on, Dr. Jaffe and Mr. Krogh, Mr. Ehrlichman. Fine. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you.
In 1970, President Richard Nixon launched the War on Drugs, an international initiative with the stated intention of reducing or eliminating drug abuse, creation, and trade.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
A growing number regard this campaign as a failure, with devastating consequences for humanity, especially since it was declared as such by the Global Commission on Drug Policy in 2011. However, that statement was made about 5 years before new information was released that completely changes the narrative of the drug war. This new information that was revealed is the quote by Nixon's chief domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, in a 1994 interview with Dan Baum.
You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Do you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Ehrlichman worked closely with Nixon during his presidency and was among those arrested for involvement in the Watergate scandal. Nixon did not defend him during his trial, and this betrayal gave him little reason to keep the secrets of the Nixon administration. This damning quote was not released until 2016, prompting some to suggest that it was fabricated by the interviewer, or even that Ehrlichman was either lying or joking. Yeah, real funny. However, this video will provide evidence that he was most likely telling the truth, as the statement accurately reflects the situation. Before we start, I would like to thank my patrons over at Patreon for making this video possible. Links are in the description if you would also like to help fund future videos. From their inception, drug laws in what is now the United States have its roots in racism and colonialism. The first drug laws were a part of the criminalization of the indigenous Americans' cultural practices during the earliest stages of the American acquisition of Turtle Island. Their sacred medicines, along with their songs, dances, and languages, were outlawed in the broader initiative to dispossess these peoples from their land and way of life. At first, these laws were a part of Christian conversion of natives, but beginning in 1880, these practices were outlawed on paper by the American government. The 1910 Mexican Revolution caused an influx of refugees in the US, and an upsurge of anti-immigration sentiment among white settlers followed. Despite the vast majority of Mexican immigrants not using cannabis, the term marijuana was used to associate them with the substance, exploiting the xenophobic tendency of the American population. The result of this campaign, to put it briefly, was a series of criminalizing policies aimed at Mexican immigrants to further limit their migration and ability to seek employment in the United States. To quote historian Isaac Campos, "When drugs are seen as foreign, they are seen as more dangerous." The smear campaigns against cannabis relied heavily on propaganda with hellish imagery, invoking white Western cultural fears, such as Christian damnation and demonic possession. By the 1960s, anti-war and black liberation movements became prominent as the televised American invasion of Vietnam was sharply intensifying, and racial segregation continued to plague BIPOC communities. These movements were staunchly opposed by the White House. In 1969, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover described the Black Panthers, a party for feeding black communities and defending them from police brutality, as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. American law enforcement escalated their attacks and began to use lethal force to stop these movements, such as with the murder of Fred Hampton and the Kent State Massacre in 1970. Among others. An extensive covert FBI counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO was launched and used illegal tactics of surveillance and infiltration, such as blackmailing activists and assassinations. As an example of how far the American government would go in order to destroy these movements, this declassified FBI document from the counterintelligence program ordered a smear campaign against actress Jean Seberg because she financially supported the Black Panthers. This state-sponsored defamation led her to have a miscarriage and is likely a large contributor to her suspected suicide a few years later. Once Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, a large part of his platform was tackling the growing crack epidemic, advocating for more aggressive policies for the war on drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
He and his wife, Nancy Reagan, founded the Just Say No drug awareness campaign based on the presumption that drug addiction was a moral failure. Reagan passed a series of drug enforcement bills with a budget of $1.7 billion, approximately $4 billion US dollars today, and imposed mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. Those caught in possession of crack were punished much harsher than those caught with cocaine, with a 100-to-1 ratio, as in 1 gram of crack cocaine would be equivalent to 100 grams of powdered cocaine in the eyes of the law. Crack was most commonly used by those in poverty as a cheaper alternative to powdered cocaine, which was primarily accessible to the wealthy, furthering the divide between classes. During his presidency, penalties for drug possession were expanded and incarceration rates skyrocketed. The majority of those imprisoned were black. It is also worth noting that both Nixon and Reagan were undoubtedly racist. This recently released tape of a phone call between them makes this assertion evident.
Those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Large anti-drug propaganda campaigns dominated children's television and advertising during the 1980s and 90s. These ads and PSAs stigmatized drug use with numerous falsehoods about the nature of these substances, stating that it would destroy the user's brain, body, and social reputation. Most, if not all, of the assertions and strategies of the propaganda campaign were not based on scientific evidence and were contrary to expert suggestions for health and safety. Many drug users became alienated from family and peers as a result, leading to increased rates of mental illness, suicidality, and homelessness. The DARE program has a fairly well-known boomerang effect on youth, meaning that students who participate in the program were actually more likely to try drugs because of it. The drug war accomplishes the opposite of what its stated goals were, as addiction rates have been completely unaffected while budgets for the war have been steadily increasing for about a half-century. Stigmatization and criminalization has alienated drug users from their family and peers, creating unsafe situations for addicts. Not regulating substances increases the likelihood of impure substances and misinformation, which are the major causes of overdoses and drug-induced deaths. America now has a quarter of the world's prison population, 2.3 million people as of 2016. And the majority of inmates are convicted on drug-related charges. Black people are disproportionately targeted with these laws, and they continue to greatly harm those communities to this day. For decades, aerial spraying of herbicides over vast amounts of lands in efforts to eliminate cocaine crops continues to damage the environment and human health. The 1990s initiative, Plan Colombia, increased American military aid to Colombia to combat drug cartels, which experts agree was largely a covert war against leftist guerrillas that has not significantly reduced drug trading in the country.
Colombia has been fighting against guerrilla groups, including FARC, that are largely financed by drug trafficking.
A similar operation, known as the Merida Initiative, was launched to train Mexican police and military to stop illegal drug trade. In 2008, it was revealed via security footage that the United States were teaching torture techniques too disturbing to include here. These operations are highly hypocritical because throughout the 80s, the Reagan administration covertly funded and trained the Contra warriors using illegal arms and drug money, even aiding and smuggling vast amounts of cocaine into LA on US military planes. This was effectively the equivalent of planting drugs on a person, except on a statewide scale. The Contras were notorious for their use of especially brutal terror tactics, and were instructed by the United States to target the civilian population of Nicaragua.
Within 6 months, by the summer of 1982, the nature of this war is clear. The proxy army does not confront the Sandinista army in open battles. Its targets are mostly peasant villages.
These issues are just a small fraction of the harms done under the US-led global drug policy. So here are some concluding points to take away from this video. 1. The drug war is not based on science, as drug scheduling does not reflect the long-stated facts by scientists on the medicinal and dangerous properties of the criminalized substances. 2. The drug war is not a health issue, as health experts have stated since the campaign's inception that treatment for drug abuse should be increased and the prison system is completely ineffective at rehabilitation. 3. The drug war reinforces poverty, as community resources are allocated to violent punishment instead of treatment and security. 4. The drug war targets marginalized groups, as proven by the statistics of the prison population. 5. The drug war provides authorities false justification to attack their enemies, evident by the funding of right-wing paramilitaries in South America to attack left-wing paramilitary groups, despite the fact that both sides are prominent drug smugglers. And finally, 6. This was all intentional. If it was not intentional, they would have stopped by now, after decades of compiling concrete evidence that these laws do not work. We cannot continue to believe that politicians and law enforcement are naive. They know what they are doing. To say the drug war is flawed is a dramatic understatement. To say the drug war has failed is incorrect and misleading. The drug war succeeded in its goal of maintaining and expanding the USA's global hegemony. To put it simply, the war on drugs is a crime against humanity. Thank you for watching.
Drugs steal away so much. They take and take until finally, every time a drug goes into a child, something else is forced out, like love and hope and trust and confidence. Drugs take away the dream from every child's heart and replace it with a nightmare.